Crowds on the steps of the Hall of Justice in Port of Spain, the capital city of Trinidad and Tobago, erupted in cheers on learning that the High Court had struck down the Caribbean nation's archaic anti-gay sodomy statutes. But that was then, April 12, 2018. 7 years later, March 25, 2025, the silence outside the courthouse was deafening. That was the day, just a few weeks ago, that a 3-judge appeals court panel overturned the High Court ruling, putting the anti-gay laws back on the books. But there's one voice that refuses to be silenced.
It's going to be a hard-fought victory, but I'm going to win. I'm going to win.
That voice belongs to Jason Jones, a biracial, binational queer activist who sued his home country in 2017, asserting that the colonial-era ban on gay sex violates his constitutional rights to privacy, liberty, and freedom of expression. Jones, who has fought for human rights on 2 continents for 4 decades, isn't about to stop now. He's appealing the appellate court decision, and this time the courtroom drama will play out in London before the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, at a place where a medieval refuge called Sanctuary Tower once stood, a place that offered protection from the overzealous enforcers of the Crown's edicts. If that's an omen, it's one Jones will readily embrace, as he fights to overturn laws that date to the reign of Henry VIII. I'm David Hunt. The island nation of Trinidad and Tobago, the southernmost country in the Caribbean, gained independence from the United Kingdom in 1962, after 160 years as a British Crown colony. But that history is not as remote or irrelevant as it seems. With the breakup of the British Empire after the Second World War, it was common for former British colonies to insert language into their constitutions, protecting existing colonial-era laws from being challenged on constitutional grounds. This language was called a savings clause or savings law clause, and it did just that. It preserved the legal status quo as former colonies transitioned to independence. But in some former colonies, including Trinidad and Tobago, that created a problem. The world has changed a lot since the waning days of the British Empire. Laws covered by the Savings Clause have not. Even though Trinidad and Tobago adopted a new constitution in 1976 when it became a republic, and even though that more modern constitution has been amended more than a dozen times, the Savings Clause is still there, still in effect. And among the old British laws it protects from judicial challenge is the Sexual Offences Act. Section 13 of that act criminalizes buggery, an Old English word for sodomy, while Section 16 criminalizes serious indecency between persons of the same sex. Buggery became part of English common law in 1533, giving King Henry VIII more control over vices that had been policed by the Catholic Church. It remained a capital offense until 1861. Jason Jones, who now lives in London, seat of a more constrained monarchy, grew up in Trinidad and Tobago, where he saw the impact of Britain's colonial legacy firsthand. While Britain decriminalized gay sex in 1967 and approved same-sex marriage in 2014, its former colonies are largely stuck in the past, an anti-gay past. Out of 56 sovereign states within the Commonwealth of Nations, 30 still criminalize same-sex intimacy between consenting adults. Many of these laws are rooted in colonial-era penal codes, such as the Buggery Act of 1533.
Well, that's the thing with colonialism. They gave us independence and that was it. They didn't give us anything else. So it's like, here you are, freedom, and fuck off. But what that did was it left us 50 years behind the global north. So not only did they just walk out, wash their hands, and say, fuck off, you're free, but they then hamstrung us with the savings clause so that we couldn't even get out of this cycle of violence that they have within British colonialism.
If you had assumed that Jones mobilized his legal challenge of Trinidad and Tobago's anti-gay laws with the backing of LGBTQ political and legal groups, you'd be wrong. Jones and a small team of lawyers working pro bono have shouldered the cause and presented the case on their own in the face of great odds.
In those kinds of very oppressive societies, it's very hard to galvanize a marginalized community into action, especially when majority of them are either in the closet or in what I call the glass closet. I mean, we have a lot of famous queer people that everybody knows is queer, but nobody talks about it. When I filed my case, not a single organization came to my support, not a single queer person came to my public support. I literally was left to hang and dry on my own. One of the things that I have learned in my 35 years of activism is take the bull by the horns. Don't wait until it's done to you to get active. So this is why I brought the legal challenge myself, because I thought this is not going anywhere. We are waiting on politicians who refuse to do this work for us. And, they need a kick up the ass, and that's why I brought the case.
The legal strategy behind Jones's case was mapped out by London solicitor Peter Laverack, then studying to become a barrister. He discovered that Trinidad and Tobago had changed its Sexual Offences Act 3 times in 1976, 1986, and 2000. Because the law had been changed, Laverack asserted, it could no longer be protected from judicial challenge by the Savings Clause. The original law was effectively gone.
Everybody said this case was impossible. And Peter, being queer and a person of color, he kind of, because I told everybody there has to be a way. So he went away and he did his research. And it was him that came up with the basis of the case. And that kind of was what triggered all the other, posh lawyers to jump on board and say, oh, yeah, this looks useful.
One of the lawyers who agreed to press Jones's case was Richard Drabble, a celebrated public law attorney who has, in a career spanning 5 decades, argued before the Supreme Court of the UK, the House of Lords, and the European Court of Human Rights. In arguing Jones versus Trinidad and Tobago, Drabble cast the nation's colonial-era anti-gay laws as legal fossils, little more than fragile shells left over from a distant past. The world, he noted, is changing. Laws that criminalize consensual sexual intimacy between adults of the same sex, he argued, have been struck down or declared unlawful by courts around the world, in the Americas, Europe, Africa, Asia, and Australasia, and declared in contravention of international treaty law, including by the European Court of Human Rights. The strategy found a receptive party in High Court Justice Devendra Rampersad, who ruled against the government in April 2018, striking down the anti-gay sections of the Sexual Offences Act. The ruling surprised everyone. Well, almost everyone.
I knew we had presented such a powerful case, and the judge, Justice Devendra Rampersad, who is a Hindu pundit in his private life, had said very early on in the case that religion had no place in this matter. And he knew that there would be a lot of religious stuff thrown around, but he's not entertaining it. This is a human rights issue, constitutional issue. So I knew I had the right judge. She was already making the right noises. And I had a sense that this case was at the right moment. So I really walked up the steps in the mindset of, I've won this.
7 years later, in March 2025, as the appellate court prepared to render its verdict on the government's appeal, thinking had changed. This time, Jones was the pessimist.
My lawyers thought we were going to win. I said, no, we're going to lose. And I had already mentally prepared for a loss. With the delays in the judgment, we had 2 delays in this judgment. And I could see what was precipitating the delays. And I knew that one judge was on my side, Kokoram. I knew one was definitely against me, Barrow. And I knew Pemberton, the woman, was on the fence. And every time the case was delayed, I could tell something had precipitated her changing her mind. And the last one was the Trump inauguration. The last delay was was 2 days after the Trump inauguration, and Trump did the whole only two genders, male, female, blah 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 blah. And I knew that she, being a Black Christian, she would have been like, you know what? If Trump could fucking do it, so can we. And that was it. It was Trump that led to this judgment.
Two of the three judges on the appellate panel, Justices Nolan Barrot and Charmaine Pemberton, ruled for the government. And just like that, the Sexual Offenses Act, with its anti-gay sodomy sections, was saved. But that's not the end of the road, or this story. The next chapter is set in London. Will the empire strike back, or strike out? You're listening to This Way Out, the International LGBTQ Radio Magazine. I'm David Hunt. Jason Jones, a biracial, binational queer activist, sued his country of birth, Trinidad and Tobago, in 2017 to overturn anti-gay sections of the Caribbean nation's Sexual Offenses Act. He unexpectedly won the first round in court in 2018, then just as unexpectedly lost on appeal this year, 2025. Even though Trinidad and Tobago is an independent republic with its own courts, its legal system is rooted in Britain's colonial era. A quirk of that legacy is that Trinidad and Tobago's Court of Final Judgment does not sit in Port of Spain, the capital city. It's called the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, and it sits in London in the Supreme Court building, across from Parliament, between Westminster Abbey and the Treasury building, poised, as it were, between God and Mammon. Later this year, the Council will take up the case of Jones versus Trinidad and Tobago. Jones explains.
The appeal is in process. I have 21 days, so we're drafting the appeal now. Even though it's not a great position to go into the appeal at the Supreme Court level, but at the same time, it is a very good position because I needed to wake people up because people thought that the 2018 was a done deal and it was all done and dusted. This loss has woken everybody up to realize what I've been trying to say to them. This is not going to be done until the fat white people in Britain sing. And that's where we're headed. And listen, it's going to be a difficult victory, for sure.
The journey that led Jones to London and to prominence as a queer activist began in Trinidad and Tobago, where he was born shortly after the country gained independence, and where he grew up in a family and community that encouraged his love of the performing arts.
I sang solo in the churches. My grandmother played the organ in the Catholic Church, so I was a kind of central figure in the Catholic Church choirs. Then got involved with performing and theatre, and that kind of became my queer family. As I tell people, I never came out. My parents outed me when I was about 14 because of the homophobic bullying that I was receiving. Luckily, I had very enlightened parents who weren't afraid to deal with what the issue was. And both my parents were journalists. My father was the first Black television announcer in the entire global South. And my mother was a very famous journalist here in the United Kingdom. So they were both very, very intelligent and very aware of homosexuality and were friends with gay men. So, this was not an unknown quantity to them. So, it was very easy for them to say, oh, well, go and talk to Uncle Peter, go and talk to Uncle Michael. They'll tell you what the deal is. And I'm very lucky that I call them my fairy god uncles. And my fairy god uncles, 4 of them mainly, were very instrumental in my upbringing and my coming to terms as being a proudly queer man.
Jones also cites the influence of his stepfather, Black Power activist Rex LaSalle, for encouraging his self-acceptance and self-reliance. LaSalle gained fame in April 1970 when, as an Army lieutenant, He led a mutiny against the government, refusing orders to fire on citizens during a brutal crackdown of the Black Power movement.
Rex was seen as quite a hero of the Black civil rights movement around the world, not just in Trinidad. So by the time he was living with us in our home, it was very clear to me that this was a person of great importance. It always kind of led me to believe that I could do whatever I wanted, that I had a choice, that there wasn't a set path, particularly in post-colonial countries. There are very specific routes for people from certain classes and certain color backgrounds, and that really kind of blew that out of the water for me and allowed me to just say, well, yeah, I can do whatever I want, and that was very unusual for the time, very unusual.
LaSalle made it possible for Jones to make a move that would change his life, a move across an ocean and across a cultural divide, to 1980s London.
I had been in the theatre for 3 years, training in musical theatre in Trinidad, and I had gotten the bug to kind of, pursue theatre and performing. And also, I had done 3 weeks with Nina Simone that carnival. This is the year that I turned 21. So this is 1984. And Rex said, well, listen, if you want to go, I'll buy you a ticket, but I'm only buying you a one-way ticket. So, you got to get out there and make it. So, yeah, he bought me a one-way ticket, and I left Trinidad on my 21st birthday, landed in London, and was in a job within 2 days. I worked at the Video Cafe in Oxford Circus, one of the first music video cafes in the world. And then started working. I got some really interesting parts in the West End. I was in a musical about Martin Luther King, written by Martin Smith, that starred Clark Peters and Oba Babatunde and Sharon D. Clark, and huge raft of huge black performers at the time. So things were looking really good. But as I went up the ranks, more and more it was said to me by casting agents, "Listen, we cannot cast you. We this was in the days before blind casting, so." If I auditioned for Les Mis, I would be told by the casting agents, "Oh, there were no black people in the French Revolution," and that's it. End of career. So, yeah, it was sad. I'm sad that I didn't get the chance, mainly because of my race. It was unfortunate because, of course, now with blind casting and things like Bridgerton, we don't see that anymore. But it's taken us a long time to get there.
It was in London where Jones took his first steps as a human rights activist, joining protests against the UK's notorious Section 28.
Section 28 was a law passed by Margaret Thatcher and the Conservatives, which forbade the promotion of homosexuality, which in effect meant that libraries couldn't stock books, teachers couldn't speak about it in schools. It literally, anything in the public domain that was funded by government, you couldn't mention anything to do with homosexuality. Those marches, I was studying at Birkbeck College at the time, and at the time there were no LGBT groups at universities even. So I said to everybody, I said, let's go and join the marches. And people were petrified to march. I mean, to identify yourself as queer was a huge deal back then. You have no idea. I mean, the first Pride marches in London, we used to have police on either side of us, protecting us from people. So, it was a big deal to identify yourselves on a march. And I just thought, you know what, I'm going to go and do it myself. And that really was kind of the moment when I realized that things are not going to change unless you get up off your ass and go and march and get active and do stuff. And that was really kind of the fire to get me started. So blame Margaret Thatcher.
Jones was also instrumental in the late 1990s in clearing the way for the foreign partners of gays and lesbians to legally reside in the UK, a victory that led to civil partnerships and then to marriage equality.
This was the first positive gay legislation in British history post decriminalization in 67. That was not my strategy. I was just part of the team. But that strategy was, here is an existing piece of legislation which we can very simply attach ourselves to. And this was the Overseas Partners Residency Act, which allowed the overseas partner of a British subject to come to Britain based on cohabitation, even if they are unmarried. And we said to Labour, who was in opposition, Tony Blair at the time, give us this. You're literally stroke of a pen. You don't need to go to Parliament. It's the minister just inserts same-sex into this already existing legislation where we'll give you the gay vote. And lo and behold, 3 months after they swept into office in a landslide victory, they passed this legislation.
Jones and his partner at the time, who was also from Trinidad and Tobago, were among 40 queer couples that tested and eventually expanded the scope of the law.
So every 28 days, we would get a letter from the Home Office saying, you've been denied, get out. We would then appeal. That went on for 2 years. They held our passports and we couldn't travel. But when we did win, what the Home Office had were 40 stacks of proof that queer people had loving family relationships with each other. Before that, there was nothing in law to show that queer people had loving, lasting relationships. Before that, they just thought we screwed each other in the bushes. And that led to civil registry 2 years later, which was, and they said to themselves, okay, well, if they have these relationships, do you think they want to have the relationships registered? And we said yes. So they did civil registry at 7 town halls around the country. The civil registry was literally just a little document that said, I love you, you love me, blah, 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 and the mayor signed it. And that was it. Had no legal ramifications whatsoever. But because so many queer people took it up, it then led to civil partnership, which then led to marriage equality. So that first instance of queer relationships being registered under law were interracial relationships, because nearly always the partner of the British subject was somebody of color, was a person of color. And that has been completely erased from queer history in the UK, because we have a racism issue in the queer community. And what happens for queer people of color is not properly recognized within queer advocacy.
Although LGBTQ people were beginning to gain social acceptance and legal protections in the UK in the 1990s and 2000s, they faced hostility, even threats of violence, in Trinidad and Tobago. And AIDS was running rampant in the island nation, resulting in the second highest infection rate per capita in the world. In the mid-1990s, Jones was back in Trinidad and Tobago, where he founded the Lambda Group, the first LGBTQ advocacy group in the Southern Caribbean. At the same time, he became the target of homophobic threats after performing in drag.
It was a full two-hour-long drag show. It was a character called Mercedes Growl, and she was a Trinidadian woman, and it was her telling her story through songs. And she was very specifically from a very specific part of Trinidad society that people could identify. And, I was making fun of that. The scandal was I was on the page of all the tabloids. And I mean, it was literally big red letters, homo, blah, blah, blah. And that had never happened in Trinidad before. I mean, it literally was the talking point of the island for weeks. And because they didn't name me, but they said, son of famous newscaster, everybody knew who it was. After the drag drama, I knew this was literally the end of life as I knew it. I even had the queer community, going against me because they they don't like the boat being rocked, especially the A-gays, the rich queens who live in the glass closets. They don't want this kind of attention. So I literally got it in the neck from everybody, from the evangelicals to the Muslims to the Hindus, the queers. Everybody literally turned against me. It was soul destroying, especially as there was no safety whatsoever. I mean, the American embassy offered me their plane to get me off the island, but I knew at that point that if I did accept that, it would, number one, reinforce the narrative that gay is a white man disease from the global north, and two, it would also kind of, I didn't want to be seen as this coward that dropped a bomb and then turned tail and ran at the first sign of problems. So I literally had to write it out. And it was, there were days and days that I would be locked in a hotel room, cheap hotel room, with no food, no access to anybody, because I was in hiding.
The violent backlash to Jones's drag performance drove him back to London, but it also drove him into court, spurring his lawsuit against Trinidad and Tobago and its Anti-Gay Sexual Offences Act. Ironically, that lawsuit now follows him to London, where the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council will decide its fate. A ruling in Jones's favor could lead to the decriminalization of same-sex intimacy in other Commonwealth countries, potentially impacting millions of LGBTQ people in former UK colonies.
The thing with the JCPC is that even though they're white, British, and sit in London, when they sit on a matter like this, it's as if they're sitting in Trinidad and Tobago. So they will be recognizing that this case is about what's happening in the Caribbean, but conversely, also reflects on their judgments. It's one thing to say, oh, well, throw our hands up, we have nothing to do, it's a savings clause. But it's another one to condemn LGBTQ plus people to a society that's endemically homophobic using laws that you created. So it's going to be a hard-won battle for sure.
For his part, Jones is ready to pass the torch of activism to the next generation, a generation he hopes to inspire to carry that torch proudly and bravely, as he was inspired by his mentors, among them Rex LaSalle, Nina Simone, and the writer C.L.R. James. Sadly, on the afternoon I talked with Jones for this program, he was preparing to attend a memorial service for LaSalle, who died in Finland in February at the age of 79.
I've always had these elders that I looked up to, that I really valued what they brought to me. These were people that all shaped who I am, and I am so grateful for how they shaped me. So, for me, mentorship is the next big step and something that I can't see myself not doing. I don't want to be here forever. I literally want to sling my hang up between two coconut trees and sip pina coladas and mentor. That's it. I do not want to be in the cut and thrust of advocacy anymore.
I'd like to thank Jason Jones for sharing his story for this feature. For This Way Out, I'm David Hunt.
Hoist up the John B. sails, see how the mainsail set. Call for the captain ashore, let me go home. Let me go home. Let me go home. I want